Have you ever thought about the role that your business plays alleviating poverty in developing nations? Today, I want to challenge you to all understand and celebrate the role that you play in feeding the world, and to understand and ensure that the role that we are playing at the moment in feeding the developing world and alleviating poverty is enabled in the future. Before I start, I just wanted to thank LiveCorp and also the Kimberley Cattlemen's Association for allowing me to have time to come and join you all here today. And before I go too much further, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Larrakia people of this land, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So have you ever stopped to think about the person that is going to enjoy your beautiful beef? When you're pushing those cattle up the race, have you ever thought, where are these little bad boys going to end up? I wonder whose tummy they're going to end up in. You know, someone's going to be enjoying the rump, the shins, the brisket, the bone will also be used, and the rumen, the teeth. The whole show is going to be going towards feeding somebody's family. When you think about it, Australian agriculture has a hugely positive impact as an export nation, alleviating poverty in our business partners and friends' countries. And I'm not sure that we stop to celebrate that role anywhere near often enough. On the whole, when Australians go to a supermarket, we don't actually think about where our food comes from. We, as producers and people involved in agriculture, obviously do, but the general population don't ever think about it, because in Australia, we're very, very blessed, and food in our country is a want, it's not a need. We don't actually know what it's like to really need food. Chances are that most people won't have thought about it, because we live in a very, very blessed country. And I, along with a lot of you here in this room, have travelled to developing nations and understand firsthand the role that you play in ensuring that there is food on the tables for people that are not as fortunate as us. So all of the producers here today I see as working in the food industry. In fact, every one of you that's involved in the supply chain, whether or not you're an exporter or a truck driver, you're all involved in the food industry, and I think that we're playing a pretty awesome role. It's a really interesting time to be working in the food space. Everywhere you look, there's articles on food saying you should be eating this, or you shouldn't be eating that, or that's good for you, that's bad for you. We've even got judgments in our country now around food. So, you know, if you eat those caged eggs, you're not a very nice human. But I think, do you think that those conversations are happening in developing nations? In nations where there's not often 3 meals a day on the table? Do you think that they're worried about whether those eggs are caged? Do you think that they're worried about is that beef killed in a certain way? Or should we be using genetically modified crops to ensure that we've got enough rice to feed our families? The chances are that they're probably not. So before I started, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of who I am as a person. So I grew up on a sheep farm. I've worked in the northern beef industry my entire career. I'm a bit of a out-of-the-box kind of girl. But I loved growing up on a farm. I think a lot of you will be able to relate to the freedom and the resilience that you get as a result of growing up on a property. I used to ride my horse to school. I've got two brothers and a sister, and we used to do mudslides down into the dam, and then Mum would hose us all off on the lawn no matter what season it was. And you know, growing up on a farm and growing up in rural Australia, you get these values that are instilled in you, and I don't think that they differ an awful lot from the values of people that we have in our end markets. As kids, we found out that diesel is explosive and petrol is actually more so. And if you douse a shearing shed brush in petrol and then you do a little line and you stand behind corrugated iron but you put bullets in it, they are actually explosive. So we learnt to take chances, and we learnt to live with the consequences. And I think that is something that goes across cultures, is that people that grow up in rural communities have that sort of character, and it's that character that is really important in building relationships for us. I've had a varied career and I've absolutely loved it. I spent 5 years working as a technical consultant in Indonesia and the Philippines mostly. So most of my presentation will refer to my experience in Indonesia. I was working in feedlot management, breeding, and then ended up doing some abattoir work after the SCAS protocols came in. I now work for the Kimberley Cattlemen's Association, which is an industry development body, and I'm absolutely loving being back up actively involved in the northern beef industry. So a little bit of background on poverty and food security. Working in the live export industry means that we're working with countries that traditionally have a higher level of poverty than we do here in Australia. And therefore, it's pretty important that we understand some of the issues that they face. The definition of poverty changes from organisation to organisation, but I couldn't sort of really clarify down, but basically what I figured was that poverty refers to the fact that you're living with not enough food, water, shelter or clothing. Understanding the poverty line is also important. So I got on the FAO website and I read that the poverty line is the minimum level of income deemed adequate in a particular country. So obviously as you get into more developed nations, the poverty line is going to increase. 1.4 billion people, or 20% of the global population, are currently living in extreme poverty below the poverty line on less than $1.25 a day. So with regards to food security is when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. I think it's particularly important to understand poverty and food security because those words are not words that we often think about here in Australia, and yet we're working in those markets. In Indonesia, the World Bank states that 12.5% of their population live below the poverty line. In Vietnam, it's 17.2%. Now, these statistics are improving, which is wonderful to see, and it's also pertinent to understand the role that Australian producers, supply chain experts, educators, trainers, government and the government are playing in this space. Something I found out while I was researching this is actually 12.5% of our population here in Australia is below the poverty line, and of that 17.3% are kids. And I know that's not relevant for this talk here at the moment, but it's relevant, it's something for us to think about. So Don and I have recently been to Papua New Guinea as part of the ACIAR Commission, and it was really interesting because quite often you think about food security, well, have they got enough calories to eat? And what we realised very acutely is that malnutrition now refers to both over and under consumption of calories, because we need to have a conversation around calories versus nutrition. It's all very well to have calories and very rapidly absorbed carbohydrates. Look at me go, nutritionist, rapidly absorbable carbohydrates. But if there is not the nutrition, then you end up getting problems with in the population with things like stunting and obesity and things like that. It was published in The Lancet in 2004 that a third of the world's population is overweight. 62% of those people are in developing countries. So when we're looking at the number of overweight and obese people in developing countries, it's more than tripled since 1980, and it's now overtaken malnourished people. In Indonesia, 37% of their population is stunted, and it's particularly important in those first 2 to 3 years of life. So I think UNICEF put it really well, is that the first 1,000 days of your life last forever. So it's really, really important that we get adequate nutrition into these kids. Stunting costs the Indonesian economy $5 billion a year. Now that is phenomenal, because what happens when people are malnourished or stunted, they actually don't grow properly, their brain doesn't develop properly, so they have no capacity to become educated. It wouldn't be a talk if I wasn't on poverty if I wasn't going to address the urban drift, particularly relevant in developing nations. Most of the poverty is in rural areas, as we all know. However, 70 million people move to urban areas in developing countries every year. In the next 25 years, 2 billion people are going to move to urban or emerging economies, doubling the global urban population. This is going to increase the built-up area by 1.2 million square kilometres in the next 25 years. Now, just to put that in perspective, that is a city almost the size of the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is 1.4 million square k's. So they're talking in the next 25 years there's going to be that much land that goes towards cities. And Mum recently went to a sustainability conference. Mum's a bit random. She likes to do some random things. So she went off and took herself off to this sustainability conference. And she was there and they were talking about urban sprawl. And Mum put her hand up and she said, "Oh, hi, I'm a farmer. I was just wondering what your strategies are for feeding all of these people." And she said she couldn't believe the response. So one person stood up and said, "We don't want agriculture near our cities because we're all going to get cancer from all the sprays." And then another lady said, "Oh, but maybe we can all have vegetable gardens on our balconies. That'll help." And then the third lady stood up and said, "Oh, we can't all have vegetable gardens on our balconies. The buildings would all fall over." Now, I don't know about you, but I think that personally we've got a little bit of work to do in our own country with understanding food security. So getting back to malnutrition, it's always very humbling when you work in a developing nation because you learn very quickly how fat you are. Annabelle Coppin and I used to work in market together, and we never really did get our final destinations right, considering Annabelle's from Yarra Station, a big cattle place in the Pilbara, and I was from a sheep farm in Victoria, but I was working in the beef industry in Indonesia and she was working in the sheep industry in the Middle East. And we would phone, we'd have Skype calls when we were both overseas, and we'd sort of talk about the challenges and what we thought the opportunities were, and she'd help me and I'd help her. But our fun thing was a quote of the day. We'd always come up with these really funny sort of things that had been said to us. And Annabelle said to me one day, she said, "I was walking down the feedlot and this Bahrainian guy says to her, Annabella, I think that you must be a cowboy." And Annabelle says, "Oh yeah," and he goes, "Oh no, cowgirl." And Annabelle says, "Oh, this is nice." And he says, "Yes, I know this because you have a very big behind." And then I said to her, "Oh, you'll never guess what was said to me today." So I was at the back of a feedlot in Indonesia and I needed to powder my nose, and I said to the girl, "Oh, can I just borrow your scooter? I've just got to hook off down to the office." And she said, no problem, I'll give you a lift." And I said, "Okay." So I balanced myself less than gracefully on the back of this scooter, and we're hooning down it was about a K to the office. And she turned around to me and she said, "Excuse me, Mr. Marriott, but my motorbike is crying because you fat like 4 man." So I was like, "Oh, well, that's a little bit exciting." So anyway, we had a bit of a laugh. It's such a gift to be able to work in this industry. So I guess the question that we're all interested in is beef important? Do we really need beef to pull people out of poverty? In Indonesia, the most highly consumed meats are fish, followed by chicken, and then beef. And we all know that eating protein is very, very important for brain development, general nutrition, and pulling people out of poverty. The average consumption of beef in Indonesia ranges from sort of about 1.7 to 2.5 kilos. I can't really nail it down. Every article that I read says something different. And the current beef price is falling, which is great, but it's about 100,000 rupees a kilo, which is about $10. So if we relate that directly to us here in this country, Australia's average income is 58 grand a year. In Indonesia, it's about 3,600. So them paying 100,000 rupees or $10 a kilo for their beef is the equivalent of us paying $161 a kilo for beef. So that's pretty interesting. So when we're talking about beef in the poverty space, is it something that we need to be worrying about? Well, the answer is a most definitely yes, because the middle class is growing, which means that the demand for beef is also growing, which is exciting. There is an increase in job creation, particularly in rural areas where there seems to be most of the poverty. Supplying jobs for these people is one of the first steps in breaking that poverty cycle, whether or not you're working in a feedlot. If you are, you're learning how to feed animals. If you're working supplying feedlot with like green chop and jagung, that sort of thing, then you're learning how to grow fodder. The live export industry alone in Indonesia supplies rural people below the poverty line with 100,000 jobs a year. And I think that that is something that's really important and to be proud of. One of the ladies that I was working with on a feedlot over there, she said to me, "Catherine, I'm so grateful for this the live export industry that you have," because she said, "I have my husband and he works in the feedlot, and now I also have a job," because a while ago Indonesia had, I'm not sure if they still do now, but they had a 10% policy that you had to be breeding, 10% of your capacity of your feedlot had to be in breeding. And this lady said, "Well, now I have a job because I look after the calves." And she said, "We used to be able to afford beef once every 2 months. But now I can feed beef to my children once every 2 weeks." Now that is phenomenal, because that is supplying an awful lot of nutrition that then helps those children become educated because their brains are developing properly. One of the reasons that I got involved in the live export industry was I could see a system that worked absolutely perfectly. We've got, there's benefits to both Australia and also Asia. At the start, when I first started, I didn't think about alleviating poverty, but it makes perfect sense. So in Australia, we have vast rangelands that need grazing to increase carbon into the soil and improve the environment. We also have a class of cattle that are lean, which is wanted, and they don't finish well all year round. Now, just north of us, we've got Indonesia and other Asian countries that have people that are they're just so resourceful. They're mostly feeding waste product, which we heard earlier, that would have been burnt in a pit, another environmental disaster. And they're turning those waste products into beef, which they need, providing jobs, which they need, and providing nutrition for their families, which they also need. And we can help them with that. It's a mutual beneficial thing. We need markets and they need food. So together we can work and supply both of our needs. It makes perfect sense. Another thing that I'm sure you're all aware of is that I really love about the live export industry is that none of the animal is wasted. It all goes into human consumption. And I think that that's a big part of alleviating poverty. The live trade is also working to support smaller holder farmers. And I told Adam I wouldn't say that, but I did. Apparently you're not allowed to say smallholders anymore. It's some other political jargon, which I'm not very good at. But anyway, and ACIAR have played a big role in improving smallholder producers, which goes towards building political relations and keeping that trade open for us. So it's very, very important. I spoke to Peter Horn yesterday from ACIAR, and I said to him, is beef really important for pulling people out of poverty? And he said, Catherine, I'll just give you an example. The other day I was talking to a man in Lombok, and he couldn't wipe the smile off his face because he had just sold 2 of his cows. He'd fed them for 2 years, and he'd sold 2 of his cows for 3,000 Australian dollars. Now, just to put that in perspective, that will then let that man live for 3 to 4 years on his current budget. So what he can then do is buy a couple of smaller cattle, grow them out over the next couple of years and pull himself out of poverty through that cycle. And all of us here in the live export industry are playing a vital role in making that happen. So relationships is the next thing. I think if we're going to maintain and keep playing the role that we are in poverty, we need to be building relationships. So we as producers and industry people are very, very good at this. There are also some politicians that are very, very good at it. However, we've had some mishaps from a political standpoint. In building relations, I think it's important to listen, respect and create empathy, find things in common, and international research also plays a huge role. Having the live trade suspended was the worst thing that we could have done from an international relations point of view. We all know that. Malcolm Turnbull last week was over in Indonesia with Joko Widodo, and one of the 3 main things that Joko is still talking about is beef self-sufficiency and making sure that we're helping them with their breeding and stuff. Now, I don't want to dwell on the past because that's not actually going to change anything. However, it is important that we learn and take away from it the things that we can. And I think from my perspective, the biggest learning is that we cannot ever cut off a country's food supply when they don't have as much to eat as we do. So we're still actively trying to rebuild and improve those relationships. Sure, there's been, the Snowden allegations and there's been the drug smugglers, but when you're over there talking in political circles in Indonesia, the thing that they always come back to is the fact that we cut off the supply chain of their food. Because to us in Australia, we don't think about it. To them, it's all they think about. If they've got enough food for their people, they don't fight. So we need to remember that. So basically what happened in that is that we've got a mismatch of dominant values. Australia, we value animal welfare on the whole higher than human welfare. I don't know what that's about, but in Indonesia, human welfare is important. Now, I'm not saying that we don't value humans and they don't value animals. I'm just saying that based on history and experience, there's different priorities. So there's a video that I would like to play, I think, that's been done recently by LiveCorp on animal welfare versus human welfare and the fact that I believe they go hand in hand. So I guess what you can take from that video is that animal welfare and human welfare absolutely go hand in hand. When I was working over in Indonesia, the amount of times that I had people say to me when I was doing abattoir audits or whatnot, Catherine, we really appreciate this. The cattle are so much quieter. We don't get hurt anymore. We love coming to work. And abattoir managers, feedlot managers would say, we can't believe it. People actually turn up to work every day. Like, it's phenomenal, and to me it makes absolutely perfect sense, and it's a beautiful space for us to be working in, because animal welfare and human welfare, as far as all of us in the room can tell, are equally as important. So I guess what it comes down to is human versus animals. Well, in Australia, just to put things in perspective, 63% of households here have pets. 41% have children. So that just gives you a little bit of some. Pets in Indonesia are not a big thing because they're too busy trying to feed themselves as people. Alison Penfold, I wanted to make special mention of. The way that she communicates on behalf of the live export industry is an absolute credit to not only herself but the industry. She really nails the fact that we do care about our animals, we do care about human welfare, and we're working really hard behind the scenes. Another really important thing in building relationships is things like the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association student exchange. I think that goes an awfully long way to making sure that we still have that market, that we can play that role in alleviating poverty. And Tracy Hayes and the team are also to be congratulated for that. Just a final point, or I've got a couple more points on building relationships before I go into closing. But something that I've reflected on a lot, and I worked really hard when I was in Indonesia to do this, was we're business partners and yet we expect everybody to speak English. And I'm hopeless at speaking Indonesian. I speak okay feedlot Indonesian. I can get by telling people, sharing my knowledge with people on what to feed and how to feed it and clean the bunks and, where's the hospitals and all that sort of stuff. Pretty everyday Indonesian I'm not so good at. But I think, I would encourage you all to have a think about, if you are going back to a country continuously, fumbling your way through some really basic language it goes such a long way to improving relations. Another one, and the final one that I just want to talk about with regards to building relations, is the power of international agricultural research. I can't tell you the respect that we get when we work in country, developing projects that are making a difference to their bottom line. And I think one of the beautiful things is that quite often the research that we do in developing countries through ACIAR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, we're able to bring that back into Australia, and it helps the Australian industry. The example that I'll give it's not a beef one, and I'm sure that there are beef ones available, but the most pertinent one that we've had recently is Panama disease in bananas. And there was an outbreak in March this year. Now QDAF, Queensland Department of Ag, Fisheries and Forestry, worked with ACIAR in the Philippines to develop a program to handle and manage Panama disease when it outbroke. So when it came into Queensland, the staff that had been working in the Philippines on the ACIAR project knew exactly what it was very, very quickly and were able to put a halt to it. So international agricultural research goes a long way to building relationships, but also improving what we've got here in our country. So I'll just finish off with some opportunities as I see it going forward with regards to maintaining our markets and alleviating poverty. I think it's important that we talk about change, because with anything with regard that involves opportunities, it's going to involve change. We can't keep doing what we've always done. Change is happening more rapidly now than it ever has before. Put your hand up if you've got an iPhone. Or a smartphone of some sort. Yeah, so most of the room do. And if you think about it, I now do my emails, I do my exercise on it. No, I'm just joking, but it can monitor it, whatever. Clearly I don't do that much exercise with my first world rump, but anyway. Weather, GPS, emails, you do the whole show. Now that thing has been around for 7 years. 7 years ago that was developed. So if you can think how quickly the world around us is changing, we need to keep up with that. Some of the things that, now I'm only one head, so I don't have all the answers, and I love talking to people and getting their ideas and then putting things into practice on behalf of industry. But some things that I've just thought about is an integrated supply chain with direct product feedback. The Kimberley Cattlemen's Association is working on developing a project plan where we can use the NLIS tags that are in the cattle in Indonesia to get feedback on how our cattle are performing and that sort of thing. That's going to aid us in breeding better cattle, having better management practices, being able to tell from year to year what we changed and what actually had a better end product. Now that is power. That's power for the producers, and it's also power for the Indonesians, because they can then make management decisions based on that information. I think another thing is reverse industry tours. We've done a few, which is fantastic, but we're quite good at going over and having a look at where our cattle go. I think it's really important that we actually do some reverse tours and bring Indonesians back and show them. Now the NTCA program is doing that, which I think is wonderful. I was involved with a program a couple of years ago where we took 12 farming women from Indonesia and we showed them around the Australian farming industry. And the reason that that was so powerful was because in life you can tell people things, but until you put your own experiences with it, or until they put their own experiences with it, it actually doesn't mean anything. So we took these women and we showed them Harvey Fresh. We took them through the milk manufacturing. And when we went over to mentor them in Indonesia, they were saying, oh yes, no, this is hygienic, look, and they're scraping their bamboo thing clean. And then I said to them, because it was a satay product that they were making, and I said, you've got capacity to sell this into supermarkets, but you need to improve your hygiene. And then they came to Harvey Fresh and they were like, oh, we get it. This is what you mean by hygiene. So by showing people, by having those reverse delegations, it's a really, really powerful thing, and it makes our trade relations much easier. Research and development is obviously another one. ACIAR have done an awful lot, and we're going to have to become more creative in that space because research funding is decreasing constantly. So our capacity for public-private partnerships is becoming more and more important. I think the role that government play is in setting up those trade relations and getting that happening. Then the government needs to get out of the way and let the private sector actually go in and run it. And I think that that's the way those public-private partnerships can work. Agricultural education is so important for pulling people out of poverty, whether or not it's supporting Indonesian or Asian students coming over, or we're going over there and learning, but agricultural education is hugely important. So is skills and knowledge sharing. Now MLA and LiveCorp have done a lot of that, as have the exporters, which is wonderful, but can we look at changing that? The Indonesian-Australian Partnership have done some great stuff, not only with NTCA but also with Nolan's, the abattoir over in Queensland, with bringing people in and sharing that knowledge. Supply chains is another one. We need to tie them all together and get more efficient. We need to be talking and having a much more collaborative and cooperative approach along it. I think that there's so much capacity for leakage at the moment and inefficiencies. People say to us, you know, we need to produce 70% more food by the year 2050 to feed the population. Well, I challenge that. 50% of the world's food that is produced at the moment is wasted before it gets to people's mouths. So is there opportunities for us to tighten that up? And I believe that there is. Australia has many things to offer that ensures agriculture is the pathway out of poverty, both now and into the future. We have cattle, we have people, we have knowledge and skills, and we have the capacity to share it all. You are all part of a system that is contributing massively to reducing poverty on a global scale, and it's imperative that we are able to continue to do this. We're able to continue the great work that's being done, and building relationships is a big part of that, acknowledging where we are and where we're wanting to go together. If you give a man a fish, you'll feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. The power of agriculture and the role that we play in alleviating poverty is enormous, and with all of us working together, I know that we'll be able to leave this planet a better place. Thank you.